August 6, 1945 dawned with a silence that would soon shatter the world. As the first rays of sunlight touched the volcanic peaks of Okinawa, Lieutenant Colonel James Howard Doolittle stood on the deck of the USS Indianapolis, unaware that his ship carried the components of humanity's most terrible weapon. 3 months had passed since the bloodiest battle of the Pacific War had ended on these very islands, where over 200,000 souls, soldiers and civilians alike, had perished in 82 days of mechanized slaughter. The air still smelled of sulfur and death. Corporal William Manchester, a Marine who had survived the hell of Okinawa, later wrote in his memoir that the island resembled a landscape from another planet, cratered and lifeless, where every cave held a ghost and every ridge remembered screams. The Japanese had defended their territory with a ferocity that shocked even hardened American commanders. Kamikaze pilots, their aircraft laden with explosives, had crashed into 34 Allied ships, killing nearly 5,000 sailors in what Admiral Chester Nimitz called the most ruthless and barbaric warfare the world has ever known. General Douglas MacArthur paced the floors of his Manila headquarters, studying maps of the Japanese mainland. Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan, loomed like a specter over every military strategist in the Pacific. Intelligence reports suggested that Japan had mobilized every able-bodied citizen for the defense of their homeland. Children as young as 13 were being trained with bamboo spears. Women practiced throwing grenades. The Japanese High Command had issued orders that stunned Allied cryptographers. The 100 million will die for the emperor and nation. According to declassified documents from the National Archives, American military planners estimated that Operation Downfall would cost between 500,000 and 1 million American casualties, with Japanese deaths potentially reaching the tens of millions. Secretary of War Henry Stimson had presented these figures to President Harry Truman in July, and the weight of those numbers had crushed the air from the room. Private First Class Eugene Sledge, exhausted and traumatized from months of island-hopping campaigns, sat in a makeshift camp on Pavuvu, cleaning his rifle for what he believed would be the final, apocalyptic battle. He had seen friends torn apart by mortars on Peleliu, watched men go mad under the constant artillery bombardment of Okinawa, and witnessed atrocities on both sides that would haunt him for the remainder of his life. In his journal, he wrote, "We are all dead men walking, waiting for the order that will send us into the maw of Japan itself." The Indianapolis cut through the Pacific waves, her crew unaware that in her hold lay the uranium core that would change warfare forever. Captain Charles McVeigh commanded the ship with precision, following strict orders to maintain radio silence and avoid zigzagging patterns that might alert Japanese submarines. It was a decision that would haunt the Admiralty and destroy McVeigh's life, but in that moment, speed was everything. The atomic components had to reach Tinian Island before the planned deployment date of August 6th. July 16, 1945 had marked the moment when humanity crossed an irrevocable threshold. In the New Mexico desert, at a site called Trinity, the first atomic bomb had detonated with a force equal to 20,000 tons of TNT. Physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer, witnessing the mushroom cloud rise into the pre-dawn sky, had quoted ancient Hindu scripture, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." The blast had been visible from over 200 miles away, and the heat at ground zero had been 4 times hotter than the surface of the sun. President Truman had received word of the successful test while attending the Potsdam Conference with Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin. The news transformed his negotiations with the Soviet leader, giving him a confidence that British Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden later described as markedly different from the uncertain man who had arrived days earlier. On July 26th, the Allied powers had issued the Potsdam Declaration, calling for Japan's unconditional surrender or face prompt and utter destruction. Prime Minister Kentaro Suzuki's government in Tokyo had responded with mokusatsu, a term that could mean either withholding comment or treating with silent contempt. The ambiguity would cost hundreds of thousands of lives. Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo had argued for accepting the terms, but War Minister Korichika Anami and the military leadership refused to consider surrender. The concept of gyokusai, shattering like a jewel, dominated their thinking. Better to die honorably than live in shame. Meanwhile, conventional bombing campaigns continued to devastate Japanese cities. General Curtis LeMay's B-29 Superfortress bombers had been conducting low-altitude incendiary raids that turned wooden Japanese cities into infernos. On March 10th, the firebombing of Tokyo had killed over 100,000 civilians in a single night, more than either atomic bomb would later claim. 66 other cities had been similarly destroyed, yet Japan's military leadership showed no inclination toward surrender. Colonel Paul Tibbets, commander of the 509th Composite Group, trained his crew in secrecy on Tinian Island. His B-29, which he would name Enola Gay after his mother, underwent modifications to carry a weapon unlike anything ever deployed in warfare. The bomb, nicknamed Little Boy, weighed 9,700 pounds and contained 64 kilograms of highly enriched uranium. Scientists estimated its yield would be equivalent to 15,000 tons of TNT, though no one could predict the full extent of destruction it would cause. The moral weight of what they were preparing to do pressed on some of the scientists involved in the Manhattan Project. Leo Szilard and other physicists had petitioned President Truman to demonstrate the bomb's power on an uninhabited island, giving Japan a chance to surrender before using it on a populated city. The petition never reached Truman's desk. Military advisors argued that Japan would not surrender without witnessing the weapon's devastating effect on their own soil, and that a demonstration might fail or that Japan might move American prisoners of war into the target area. August 6, 1945, at 02:45 hours, 3 B-29 bombers lifted off from Tinian Island's North Field. The night was clear, stars scattered across the Pacific sky like shards of broken glass. Colonel Tibbets guided the Enola Gay down the runway, the massive weight of Little Boy secured in the bomb bay. 2 observation planes, the Great Artiste and Necessary Evil, followed carrying scientific instruments and cameras to document what no human had witnessed before: a nuclear weapon deployed against a populated city. Hiroshima awakened to another summer morning. The city sprawled along the delta of the Ota River, its 7 channels reflecting the early morning light. With a population of over 350,000, including 43,000 soldiers, Hiroshima served as headquarters for the Japanese Second General Army. But it was also home to thousands of civilians, schoolchildren, factory workers, mothers preparing breakfast, elderly men tending gardens. 13-year-old Akiko Takakura was walking to work at the Hiroshima Bank when she saw the B-29, a silvery speck against the blue sky. Air raid sirens had not sounded because reconnaissance planes routinely flew over without attacking, and the city's defenders had grown complacent. She would later recall the moment with crystalline clarity: the plane opening its belly, something falling, then a flash brighter than 1,000 suns. At 08:15 hours and 17 seconds, Little Boy detonated 1,900 feet above the Shima Surgical Clinic. The uranium projectile had slammed into the target cylinder, achieving critical mass and releasing the energy of 15 kilotons of TNT in a fraction of a second. The temperature at the hypocenter reached 7,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Human bodies within half a mile of ground zero were instantly vaporized, their shadows permanently burned onto concrete walls and stone steps, ghostly silhouettes that would haunt the world for generations. The blast wave traveled outward at over 700 miles per hour, obliterating everything in its path. Wooden buildings disintegrated into splinters. Concrete structures crumbled like sandcastles. The characteristic mushroom cloud rose 40,000 feet into the stratosphere, visible for over 200 miles. Captain Robert Lewis, co-pilot of the Enola Gay, scribbled in his log, "My God, what have we done?" According to estimates compiled by the Radiation Effects Research Foundation, over 70,000 people died instantly that morning. Another 70,000 would succumb to injuries and radiation sickness over the following months. Dr. Michihiko Hachiya, director of the Hiroshima Communications Hospital, survived the blast and documented the horror in his diary. "Hundreds of injured people who were trying to escape to the hills passed our house. The sight of them was almost unbearable. Their faces and hands were burnt and swollen, and great sheets of skin had peeled away from their tissues to hang down like rags on a scarecrow. They moved like a line of ants. All through the night they went past our house, but this morning they had stopped. I found them lying on both sides of the road so thick that it was impossible to pass without stepping on them. Emperor Hirohito sat in silence within the imperial palace as reports from Hiroshima filtered through military channels. The initial communications had been confused and contradictory. Some reports claimed a new type of bomb had obliterated the city. Others suggested a meteor strike. It would take days for the full scale of the devastation to become clear, but even preliminary accounts suggested an unprecedented catastrophe. The Supreme War Council, known as the Big Six, convened an emergency session. War Minister Anami insisted the reports were exaggerated, that conventional bombing could not possibly destroy an entire city with a single weapon. Navy Minister Mitsumasa Yonai and Prime Minister Suzuki urged caution, suggesting they investigate before responding. Foreign Minister Togo pushed aggressively for immediate acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration, arguing that further resistance would only bring more destruction. Meanwhile, halfway across the world, President Truman released a statement that would echo through history. 16 hours ago, an American airplane dropped one bomb on Hiroshima. It is an atomic bomb. It is a harnessing of the basic power of the universe. The force from which the sun draws its power has been loosed against those who brought war to the Far East. If they do not now accept our terms, they may expect a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which has never been seen on this earth. The Japanese military leadership remained defiant. General Anami, who controlled the army's response, argued that surrendering without fighting for the homeland would dishonor every soldier who had died in the emperor's name. He pointed to the massive defensive preparations. Over 2 million soldiers stationed on Kyushu and Honshu, thousands of kamikaze planes and boats ready to destroy any invasion fleet, and the mobilization of civilian militia numbering in the millions. He believed America possessed only one atomic bomb and that Japan could endure and eventually force a negotiated peace. But even as the military leadership debated, another weapon was being prepared. On Tinian Island, technicians assembled Fat Man, a plutonium implosion device more complex than Little Boy. The target was Kokura Arsenal, a major weapons production facility. However, weather and fate would intervene, redirecting history's second nuclear attack to a different city entirely. August 9, 1945 began with another complication for Japan. At 0100 hours, the Soviet Union declared war and launched a massive invasion of Manchuria. Over 1 million Soviet troops, supported by tanks and aircraft, smashed through Japanese defensive lines. The Kwantung Army, once Japan's most formidable fighting force, had been stripped of its best units to defend the home islands and could offer only token resistance. Stalin had promised at Yalta to enter the Pacific War 3 months after Germany's surrender, and he kept that promise with devastating efficiency. The Soviet declaration shattered one of Japan's last hopes. Many in the government had believed they could negotiate a peace through Moscow, using the Soviet Union as an intermediary. Now that option evaporated like morning mist under the harsh sun of geopolitical reality. Japan stood completely alone, facing enemies from every direction, armed with weapons that could erase cities in seconds. August 9, 1945, Major Charles Sweeney piloted Boxcar toward Kokura, but heavy cloud cover obscured the primary target. After 3 passes with no visual confirmation and with fuel running low, Sweeney made the fateful decision to proceed to the secondary target, Nagasaki. The city, nestled in valleys between mountains, was home to over 240,000 people and served as a major shipbuilding center. Father Maximilian Kolbe, a Polish priest who had died in Auschwitz 4 years earlier, had established a Franciscan monastery on the outskirts of Nagasaki. His brothers in faith were conducting morning prayers when Fat Man detonated at 11:02 hours, 3,600 feet above the Urakami Valley. The plutonium core imploded with a yield of 21 kilotons, more powerful than Little Boy but partially contained by Nagasaki's geography. 16-year-old Sumateru Taniguchi was delivering mail on his bicycle when the flash came. The thermal radiation seared the skin off his back and left arm, burning so deeply that his internal organs were exposed. He would lie on his stomach for 2 years, unable to move, while doctors fought to keep him alive without painkillers or antibiotics. His survival, and his later work as a hibakusha activist, would become a testament to human resilience and a warning against nuclear weapons. The bomb's blast wave channeled through the valleys, focusing its destructive power on the Mitsubishi Steel and Arms Works and the Urakami Cathedral, the largest Christian church in East Asia. Over 70,000 people died instantly or within the first day. Thousands more would die from radiation poisoning, burns, and injuries in the weeks and months that followed. Dr. Takashi Nagai, a radiologist at Nagasaki Medical College, lost his wife in the bombing but continued treating victims while suffering from radiation exposure himself. In Tokyo, the Supreme War Council met in an emergency session that stretched through the night of August 9th and into the early hours of August 10th. The meeting took place in an underground bunker as American B-29 bombers continued conventional raids on the capital. The room was stifling, the air thick with cigarette smoke and the weight of impossible decisions. 3 members of the council, Prime Minister Suzuki, Foreign Minister Togo, and Navy Minister Yonai, favored accepting the Potsdam Declaration with one condition: that the emperor's sovereignty be maintained. 3 opposed: War Minister Anami, Army Chief of Staff Yoshijiro Umezu, and Navy Chief of Staff Suemu Toyoda, insisting on additional conditions including no occupation of the home islands, Japan conducting its own war crimes trials, and voluntary disarmament. The council was deadlocked, unable to reach the unanimous decision required by Japanese governmental tradition. For the first time in modern Japanese history, the emperor would have to break the tie and make the decision himself. August 10, 1945, shortly after 0200 hours, Emperor Hirohito entered the bunker where the Supreme War Council had been deadlocked for hours. His presence was unprecedented. Japanese emperors traditionally remained above political disputes, their role symbolic rather than executive. But these were not traditional times, and the alternatives had narrowed to surrender or annihilation. Prime Minister Suzuki knelt before the emperor and requested that His Majesty make the final decision. What followed became known as the voice of the crane, the emperor's sacred judgment that could not be questioned. Hirohito spoke in the formal court language that few of his subjects ever heard, his voice soft but clear. I have given serious thought to the situation prevailing at home and abroad, and have concluded that continuing the war can only mean destruction for the nation and prolongation of bloodshed and cruelty in the world. The time has come when we must bear the unbearable. War Minister Anami wept openly, though whether from relief or shame no one could say. He had dedicated his life to the military code of Bushido, which held that surrender was the ultimate disgrace. Yet he bowed to the emperor's will, as did the other military leaders. A message was transmitted to the Allies through neutral Switzerland, indicating Japan's willingness to accept the Potsdam Declaration, provided the said declaration does not compromise any demand which prejudices the prerogatives of His Majesty as a sovereign ruler. The American response, crafted by Secretary of State James Burns, proved deliberately ambiguous. From the moment of surrender, the authority of the emperor and the Japanese government to rule the state shall be subject to the supreme commander of the Allied powers. This phrasing neither guaranteed nor denied the emperor's continued role, leaving room for interpretation on both sides. Between August 10th and August 14th, Japan existed in a state of suspended animation. American bombers continued their raids, dropping conventional weapons and propaganda leaflets. The leaflets warned of more atomic bombs to come, a bluff, as the United States had no more ready for immediate deployment. Soviet forces rolled through Manchuria and Korea, killing thousands of Japanese soldiers and civilians. And in Tokyo, military hardliners planned one final, desperate act. A group of young officers, led by Major Kenji Hatanaka, plotted to seize the imperial palace, destroy the recording of the emperor's surrender announcement, and continue the war. On the night of August 14th, they murdered Lieutenant General Takeshi Mori, commander of the 1st Imperial Guards Division, and used forged orders to search the palace for the recording discs. War Minister Anami, aware of the plot, refused to either support or stop it, maintaining a calculated ambiguity. The coup failed when the conspirators could not locate the recordings, which had been hidden by court chamberlain Yoshihiro Tokugawa. in a safe disguised as a stack of documents. General Shizuichi Tanaka, commander of the Eastern District Army, arrived at the palace and convinced the rebels to stand down. Major Hatanaka and Lieutenant Colonel Jiro Shiizaki drove to the plaza in front of the imperial palace and shot themselves. War Minister Anami committed seppuku at his home, leaving a final message. I, with my death, humbly apologize to the Emperor for the great crime. He died as the sun rose on August 15th. August 15th, 1945, at 12 noon Japan Standard Time, millions of Japanese people gathered around radios to hear something unprecedented, the voice of their emperor. Many had never heard Hirohito speak. Some believed he was a god made flesh, literally divine, and the thought of hearing his voice inspired both reverence and terror. The recording quality was poor, and Hirohito spoke in classical Japanese that many common citizens struggled to understand. But his message was unmistakable. We have resolved to pave the way for a grand peace for all the generations to come, by enduring the unendurable and suffering what is insufferable. Japan had surrendered. The war was over. Across the Japanese home islands, reactions varied wildly. Some people wept in relief that the bombing would stop, that their children might live. Others collapsed in despair, unable to comprehend a Japan that had surrendered. Many soldiers could not accept it. Isolated units in the Philippines, Burma, and Pacific Islands would continue fighting for months or even years, unaware or refusing to believe that their emperor had ordered them to lay down arms. On Tinian Island, the crew of the Enola Gay received the news with subdued satisfaction. They had accomplished their mission, potentially saving millions of lives by making an invasion unnecessary. Yet the weight of what they had done, incinerating 2 cities, killing over 200,000 people, would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Co-pilot Robert Lewis struggled with alcoholism and depression. Bombardier Tom Farabee defended the mission until his death, insisting they had done what was necessary. Navigator Theodore Van Kirk refused to call himself a hero, saying simply, "I was there." General Douglas MacArthur was appointed Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, tasked with overseeing Japan's occupation and reconstruction. He arrived in Japan on August 30th, stepping off his plane at Atsugi Naval Air Base without a weapon, deliberately demonstrating confidence that the Japanese would honor their surrender. His aides had warned him of possible assassination attempts, but MacArthur understood the dramatic gesture's importance. The formal surrender ceremony took place on September 2nd, 1945, aboard the battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu, walking with a cane due to injuries from a bombing in China years earlier, signed first for Japan. General Yoshijiro Umezu, the Army Chief of Staff who had opposed surrender until the end, signed second, his face a rigid mask. MacArthur signed for the Allied Powers, flanked by representatives from China, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, Australia, Canada, France, the Netherlands, and New Zealand. MacArthur's speech at the signing ceremony emphasized reconciliation rather than vengeance. "It is my earnest hope, and indeed the hope of all mankind, that from this solemn occasion a better world shall emerge out of the blood and carnage of the past." The words rang hollow to many who had suffered under Japanese occupation: Koreans forced into sexual slavery, Chinese civilians massacred in Nanjing, Allied prisoners of war tortured and starved. Justice and reconciliation would prove complicated partners in the years ahead. The human cost of the Pacific Theater's final days remains staggering and contested. Conservative estimates suggest that the 2 atomic bombs killed between 150,000 and 240,000 people by the end of 1945. Radiation-related deaths would continue for decades, affecting survivors and their children through increased rates of cancer and other illnesses. Yet military historians argue that the atomic bombs averted an even greater catastrophe. Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan, would have commenced with Operation Olympic on November 1st, 1945, targeting Kyushu. Operation Coronet would have followed in March 1946, landing on the Kanto Plain near Tokyo. Based on the ferocity of fighting on Iwo Jima and Okinawa, Casualty projections ranged from 500,000 to over 1 million Allied deaths, with Japanese military and civilian deaths potentially reaching 20 million. Historians also note that conventional bombing and the Soviet invasion may have been equally or more important in forcing Japan's surrender. The firebombing campaigns had killed more Japanese civilians than both atomic bombs combined. The Soviet invasion shattered Japan's last hope for a negotiated peace and threatened to split the country into occupation zones, as had happened in Germany. The atomic bombs provided a face-saving exit, allowing Japan's leadership to surrender to an overwhelming, unprecedented weapon rather than simply to enemy conventional forces. Dr. Tsutomu Yamaguchi experienced both atomic bombings, surviving Hiroshima while on a business trip, and returning home to Nagasaki in time for the second attack. He lived until January 4, 2010, becoming a vocal advocate for nuclear disarmament. His testimony and that of thousands of other hibakusha reminded the world that nuclear weapons are not merely military tools, but instruments of mass civilian suffering. The Pacific Theater's conclusion inaugurated the nuclear age, fundamentally altering international relations and military strategy. The terrifying power demonstrated at Hiroshima and Nagasaki created a paradox: weapons too destructive to use but too powerful to abandon. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction emerged during the Cold War, based on the premise that nuclear war could never be won and must therefore never be fought. Japan's reconstruction under American occupation transformed the nation from militaristic empire to pacifist democracy. Article 9 of the new Japanese Constitution, written largely by American advisors, renounced war as a sovereign right and prohibited Japan from maintaining military forces beyond those necessary for self-defense. This radical experiment in imposed pacifism succeeded beyond anyone's expectations, allowing Japan to redirect resources toward economic development and becoming the world's second-largest economy by the 1980s. The moral debate over Hiroshima and Nagasaki continues to this day. Some argue that President Truman made the only rational decision available, choosing to end the war quickly and save lives on both sides. Others contend that Japan was already defeated, that the atomic bombs were unnecessary, and that their primary purpose was to intimidate the Soviet Union in the emerging Cold War. Still others suggest that alternatives existed: a demonstration bombing, a continued blockade, guaranteed retention of the emperor, that were never seriously explored. What remains indisputable is that the final days of the Pacific Theater demonstrated both humanity's capacity for breathtaking destruction and its possibility for reconciliation. Japan and the United States, bitter enemies whose soldiers fought with particular savagery, became close allies within a generation. The atomic bomb's shadows stretched across the second half of the 20th century and into the 21st, a permanent reminder that humanity now possesses the power to destroy itself. Whether we also possess the wisdom to prevent such destruction remains the central question of our age, written in the ashes of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, in the blood-soaked sands of Pacific Islands, and in the voices of those who survived to tell their stories, voices we would be foolish and dangerous to ignore.